Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. Okay, so over a year ago, I made this video where I responded to a video made by an orthodontist named Brian Dye, who is convinced he has discovered the cure for hair loss. His claim is that the position of the jaw determines the pattern of baldness, and that certain jaw structures can occlude the superficial temporal artery and prevent blood and oxygen from reaching the scalp, and thus accelerate androgenic alopecia. So, in case it isn't abundantly obvious, Brian Dye is trying to sell people a repackaged version of the rebuttal theory, which of course is a completely false theory, but since so many hair loss sufferers are terrified of conventional treatments like finasteride, snake oil salesmen like him still nevertheless find an audience of desperate baldies who will do anything they can to stop hair loss other than actually use the treatments which are clinically proven to work. Now, scam artists claiming you can treat your hair loss by improving blood flow are a dime per dozen these days, and they're all over the internet, and I'll link a few videos below where I call some of the other scammers out who promote the blood flow theory, like Rob England and Paul Taylor. So, what does Brian Dye do specifically to stand out from the rest of these charlatans? Well, his theory purports that the blood flow in the superficial temporal artery is dependent on the position of the jaw. If you have a type 2 jaw alignment, which means the jaw is located further back in the skull, the jawbone impinges on the superficial temporal artery, which reduces blood flow to the scalp and thus causes hair loss. On the other hand, Brian Dye says that if you have a type 3 jaw alignment, where the jaw is located more forward in the skull, there is no impingement on the superficial temporal artery, and so there is no hair loss. So, in my last video, I completely dismantled his idiotic theory by showing how it is both wrong in practice and in theory, and I'll go ahead and link that video below, so be sure to check it out in case you haven't already. But just to briefly reiterate some of the points I made in that video, the superficial temporal artery has nothing to do with hair loss to begin with. So trying to treat hair loss by targeting the superficial temporal artery would be about as effective as trying to treat hair loss by getting a foot massage. It's 100% worthless, and the people who keep promoting the blood flow theory do not understand the vascular anatomy of the scalp. The blood vessels that supply blood to the scalp are all interconnected, so their blood supply is redundant. To give you an idea of what that means, you can imagine a water pump that pumps water into a tank but splits off into 6 different pipes. If you were to close off one pipe, the water pressure would just increase in the other pipes, and the amount of water being pumped into the tank would remain the same. The same thing is true with the superficial temporal artery, and we know it is true because there is even a cosmetic surgical procedure where people who don't like the way the superficial temporal artery looks under their skin will have it surgically ligated, meaning it is tied off completely. The surgeons who perform the surgery make note of the fact that there is no hair loss as a consequence of this procedure, and it is because of the redundancy of the scalp vascular network. So even if the jaw were impinging on the superficial temporal artery, it would not cause hair loss. Also, the idea that hair loss is caused by poor blood flow isn't true to begin with, not just because of the blood vessel redundancy, but also because low blood flow to the scalp is a consequence and not a cause of hair loss, and I went over this in many videos, but probably the most extensive one I did is my response video to what I've learned at Rob England, which I'll link below. The point is, though, is that even if you do believe in the blood flow theory, Brian Dye is still completely wrong here because the superficial temporal artery is not critical for blood flow in the scalp. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a safe way to ligate it for cosmetic reasons, even though this is a fairly common procedure we're talking about here, especially since many people don't like the way the artery bulges out of their temples. In the last Brian Dye video that I did, I also made the case that this guy's sudden desire to delve into the topic of hair loss was strongly linked to the fact that orthodontics is a dying field, and so therefore orthodontists like Brian Dye need some new gimmick in order to rejuvenate their practice, and things haven't gotten any better in the last year since at-home orthodontics tools like Invisalign have allowed people to straighten their teeth from the convenience of their own home and without having frequent overpriced visits to the orthodontist, since you can get Invisalign from just any old regular dentist. Invisalign is also a much more aesthetically pleasing way to fix your teeth as opposed to braces, which are probably the reason the majority of millennials started college as virgins. So, practicing orthodontists like Brian Dye know that their line of work is soon going to be about as relevant as elevator operators and typewriter manufacturers, so in desperation to save his practice, he's now trying to scam hair loss sufferers by reviving an obsolete hair loss theory. I thought I had heard the end of Brian Dye and his stupid dental malocclusion theory, country, but nearly 2 years after he's uploaded his original video, which I destroyed, he's now back with a follow-up video where instead of admitting he came to the wrong conclusions, he's now instead doubling down and manages to make this new video even worse than his last one in every single way, except for one thing. It's mercifully shorter at only 6 minutes instead of 23 minutes, so thank God that his response video isn't that long, and hopefully my response video won't be that long either. But anyways, let's go ahead and go balls deep and scientifically dismantle this trash video, because even though orthodontics might be obsolete, being a hair loss witcher sure as hell isn't. So for a science-based video, this intro looks more like something I would see from some new age meditation video about aligning my chakra instead of aligning my jaw, but let's go ahead and hear Dr. Dye out.
Hi again. Sorry for the delay on the Doppler updates.
It's okay. Honestly, I actually wish the delay had been a bit longer. In fact, I was hoping it would even be indefinite, as I was working on a video about dutasteride until someone gave me the bad news that you and your stupid theories still exist and you uploaded a new video, but hopefully after today, this will be it.
Who knew acquiring Doppler blood flow pressure measurements during and after COVID would be so difficult? But we got them.
Yeah, designing a study with selection bias issues takes a lot of time and effort. I mean, just ask the PFS network.
So the first thing we did was find the blood flow pressure measurement on the superficial temporal artery on men in their 30s with a full head of hair. And the average blood flow pressure measurement is 90 centimeters per second. Now, the Doppler scans on bald men with the visual of the bald scalp on one side and the coinciding blood pressure measurement on the other side. As you can see, the blood flow pressure counts on bald men are far lower than the average of 90 centimeters.
So after nearly 2 years, here is the proof he presents us. He says that he measured the Doppler blood flow in men in their 30s who had a full head of hair and got an average value of 90 centimeters per second. He then shows 12 pictures of bald men with Doppler blood flow measurements ranging from 18 to 40 centimeters per second. Believe it or not, this is the entirety of the evidence he shows. I'm sorry, this is not science. The data he presents has not been published in any peer-reviewed journal. He completely omits from the video critical information that is necessary in order to evaluate any of his claims. For instance, he doesn't say how many subjects were in the hair loss group versus the normal hair group. He doesn't say what the average Doppler value was in the hair loss group. He doesn't give any statistics like the standard deviation of the two groups or whether there was actually a statistically significant difference between the two groups. He doesn't say how he recruited the subjects, whether they were just consecutive patients in his practice or whether they were selected in any way. He doesn't say whether the technician who did the Dopplers was blinded to the hair state of the subjects. I mean, this could have easily been done by covering their hair with a surgical hair cover, but he didn't do any of that. Essentially, we know nothing about the reliability of this data except for what he is claiming in this video. There are also some technical characteristics of the Doppler measurements that we aren't informed about in this video. For example, we don't know whether Dr. Dye is talking about peak flow in the blood vessels versus average flow. Arteries have pulsatile flow, and there's a big difference between the peak flow and average flow. This is similar to blood pressure, where it is measured using two numbers, like the systolic and the diastolic pressure. If you look at the numbers Dr. Dye gives, they are a little suspect. In this study that compared the peak Doppler blood flow between people with normal superficial temporal arteries and people with diseased temporal arteries, this figure summarizes the results of the study. If you look at the last line of the third column, the average normal superficial temporary artery blood flow is 55 centimeters per second with a standard deviation which is related to the range in values of only 13 centimeters per second. So the value he supposedly got in people with full heads of hair, specifically 90 centimeters per second, is a lot higher than normal, and the value in people with hair loss is closer to what the normal value would be. So all this means is that the data he cites really needs to be gone over with a fine-tooth comb, but we don't have that opportunity since it is not published, and Dr. Dye spends the rest of the video spewing broccoli and grapefruit juice at us.
Now for me, this is a aha moment where on one side of the glenoid fossa you have 90 centimeters of blood flow pressure, and on the anterior or the front portion of the superficial temporal artery you have 18 or 20 or very low blood flow pressure measurements.
So he's just repeating himself here, but he shows his bias because he cites 90 centimeters per second for the people with normal hair, but only 18 to 20 centimeters per second, which were the very lowest numbers he showed for the people who were bald, even though their Doppler velocities were as high as 40 centimeters per second, or even higher for all we know, since he clearly did not present all the data. Anyways.
In these two videos and paper, I, Brian Dye, have brought forward evidence-based science that no one knew existed.
I am Brian Dye, master of the universe.
Are you not aware that I graduated top of my class?
Quite an accomplishment.
I've shown you how this science works. I've also shown you the common link all men balding on the vertex of the head have. And I've showed you how to achieve that.
No, you haven't proven anything other than your own arrogance in thinking you somehow found some connection that explains hair loss that thousands of doctors, scientists, pharmacists, and chemists have somehow missed over the past century. You're not nearly as smart as you think you are.
Yes, I am saying balding is a dental problem that can be solved through dentistry. At this point, general dentistry and traditional orthodontics don't even realize this is the cause of the occlusal pathology that causes balding, sleep apnea, TMD, perforated meniscus, artificial aneurysm, Bell's palsy, and giant cell syndrome.
I have recently discovered a cure-all of unrivaled potency.
So not only does fixing your jaw alignment with orthodontists cure hair loss, it also cures autism, COVID-19, leaky gut syndrome, adrenal fatigue, and whatever condition made Jason Blaha the way he is.
Hair grow products. Successful hair grow products all contain histamine. That's because when histamine is taken or applied, it broadens arteries, allowing more blood to flow in a constricted artery.
Whoa, wait a minute. Every hair growth product contains histamine? Are we talking about things that actually work here, like finasteride and minoxidil? Because that's news to me. What I think he's trying to say is that hair growth products like minoxidil work by vasodilation, which improves blood flow. However, this is completely false, because even though minoxidil is a vasodilator, if vasodilation were the reason it worked, then every other vasodilating drug, including common blood pressure medications, would also work, but none of them do work, and that's because minoxidil's mechanism of action is completely unrelated to blood flow. The way minoxidil works isn't officially known, but the most plausible explanation is that it opens up a potassium channel that triggers the anagen growth phase directly in the hair follicles. There are several other theories as well as to how it works, but all of them are completely unrelated to blood flow. As far as histamines go, there is some very weak research that certain histamines like Cetirizine might have some mild hair growth properties, and I talk about that in my Cetirizine video, which is linked below, but the point is, he's saying that all successful hair growth products contain histamine, which is factually inaccurate. Finasteride minoxidil would certainly fall under the criteria of being successful hair growth products, but neither of them contain histamine. So I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but it is totally wrong, just like everything else in this video.
The problem is, eventually, left untreated, the condyle will completely block the superficial temporal artery, and no amount of hair growth product will work at this point, and the mandible is still dislocated.
No, we already went over this. You can completely tie off the superficial temporal artery and it still doesn't cause hair loss. The blood supply to the scalp is not dependent on the superficial temporal artery. Also, he offers no evidence that over time the superficial temporal artery closes off with age. In fact, I found absolutely no evidence that this happens at all. In addition, I don't think he is correct about the anatomy. If you look at a CAT scan of the head, it appears that the superficial temporal artery actually courses over the temporomandibular joint and not inside the joint like he claims. After all, it is a superficial artery that runs just under the skin. In fact, it is so superficial that it is normally the only artery that is visible under the skin. In fact, the superficial temporal artery, rather than disappearing, usually gets more prominent and more visible with age. If it was truly becoming blocked off in men as age progresses, the opposite would happen. It would become invisible with age instead of more prominent, which is what actually happens. This is why older people will have the cosmetic surgery that I already mentioned ligates the artery completely, which again does not cause hair loss at all.
The new language of balding, DHT, beta inhibitors, and so on. You know how they discovered DHT was by extracting fluid from the scalp of a bald man. And they analyzed what they found and they named it DHT.
What in Lord Xenu's name is this clown talking about here? DHT was not first discovered by extracting fluid from a bald scalp. It was known about way back in 1935 when it was first synthesized. Its role in hair loss wasn't known about until the 1970s, but it wasn't through extracting fluids from the scalps of bald people that we found out about it. It was through observations of a population of pseudo-hermaphrodites in the Dominican Republic by a researcher named Dr. Julian Imperato McGinley, who found that men born with a genetic deficiency in the 5-AR enzyme had low DHT levels and they never went bald or had enlarged prostates. So I don't know where he came up with this, but DHT was discovered decades before we even knew it had anything to do with hair loss.
My understanding of what's really going on is the hair is falling out because the superficial temporal artery is blocked, stranding unoxygenated, decomposing blood.
What does he mean by decomposing blood? Is the blood rotting in the body or something? If that were the case, we'd develop sepsis and die, so hair loss would probably be the least of our worries. Also, even if there was a low amount of oxygen to the scalp, that wouldn't even cause hair loss to begin with. In fact, hypoxic environments have even been linked to hair growth. There is even a hair growth stimulant on the market today called stamoxetine that works through this very mechanism because it is based on the evidence that hypoxia actually stimulates hair growth. So even if what Dr. Dye is saying about the superficial temporal artery were true, which it isn't, the consequence would not be hair loss anyways. It could possibly even be hair growth instead.
Now the white blood cells arrive, ridding the body of all these decomposing contaminants, and further go on to patrol the scalp, which it could never do before because the vertex follicle pad / organ was in the way.
What the hell is he talking about here? The vertex follicle pad / organ was in the way? This is complete gibberish. It is about as coherent as Jordan Peterson when he name drops Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in order to make a point about how the wokeness in Marvel films is bringing the USA closer to Stalinism.
What they found and called DHT was just a heightened awareness of white blood cells.
So now DHT isn't even a real chemical, rather it is just some sort of state of mind bringing about heightened awareness of white blood cells. Maybe solving hair loss is all about meditation and achieving a state of zen by finding our place in the cosmos. In case it isn't obvious, this guy is just throwing around a bunch of confusing word salads without any real meaning as a means of making himself sound smarter than he really is.
And testosterone has nothing to do with balding. There's plenty of documented cases of castrated men with full heads of hair.
I agree with him that testosterone itself doesn't cause hair loss, and I have a video where I explain that below. However, he's drawing the wrong conclusion from the fact that castrated men have full heads of hair. They have full heads of hair not because they lack testosterone, because they lack the metabolite of testosterone, DHT, which is the cause of hair loss. So what he's saying isn't wrong, but when the 5-AR enzyme isn't inhibited, testosterone levels are correlated with DHT levels. So if someone is castrated, they will have both low testosterone and low DHT levels. What he doesn't mention is that people born without the 5-AR enzyme also don't go bald ever, even though their testosterone levels are normal or even high, which proves that it is DHT that is solely responsible for the progression of androgenic alopecia. I might add that presumably these people who are castrated or who have 5-AR deficiency and who have normal hair growth also may have a type 2 malocclusion of their jaw, and they still never go bald, further proving that Dr. Dye's theory is complete bullshit.
And genetics. If genetics had anything to do with balding, we're all genetically exposed. We all have hair to lose at some point. We all have lips and teeth and muscle to provide the hair loss service.
More complete gibberish. What in the hell is this hair loss service he's talking about? He also says genetics don't play a role? Who in the hell is this guy kidding? There are over 250 genes associated with androgenic alopecia. It has been known for over a century that it is an inherited condition, and we know this thanks to the works of a scientist from 1916 named Dorothy Osborn, who first described the inheritance of androgenic alopecia, and even she was able to prove the blood flow theory was complete bullshit because she made note of the fact that the pattern of hair loss did not match the tension from hat bands that were commonplace in that era. So Dr. Dye is literally trying to resurrect a theory that was debunked 107 years ago. The only difference is he's replacing hats with jaw position.
But sometimes the timing of the replacement teeth is delayed, allowing the lips and their 200 grams of pressure to do what they do, causing the maxilla to be deficient, forcing the lower teeth and mandible backward. Now, when the replacement teeth fully erupt, they do not fit together correctly, and takes some time to wear into a backward or distalized location, all around the age of 30, where the pathology of balding increases tenfold every year.
So what he's trying to do here is correlate the time course of the changes in teeth that lead to changes in jaw position to the time course of the occurrence of balding. I assume what he's saying about growth and loss of baby teeth and wisdom teeth is accurate since he is, after all, a dentist. However, he is claiming that the peak of androgenic alopecia is age 30 and that this time correlates with the changes in the jaw structure. Even if this is true, this is just a correlation fallacy and doesn't prove any causation. Additionally, people often start developing androgenic alopecia much younger than the age of 30. It can pretty much start happening anytime as soon as puberty begins. There are people with very aggressive hair loss who are literally full-blown Norwood 7s in their 20s, which would be far sooner than Dr. Dye's jaw mechanism would have a chance to cause baldness. So, if it takes up to our 30s before the jaw starts accelerating hair loss, then how can he possibly explain people who have very premature baldness? The only reason we might see hair loss more commonly at around the age of 30 is because hair growth is cyclical. It doesn't just fall out and then you're bald. It has to go through several cycles of miniaturization before it becomes noticeable, and that can take years, and I'll link my video on shedding below in case you want to learn more about that. But anyways, even if someone does start balding at the age of 30, their androgenic alopecia likely began years before any of these jaw changes could possibly happen.
Okay, having said all that I have, I, Brian Dye, declare I have found what causes balding.
How exactly do you plan to do that?
I have the evidence-based science on how to eliminate it. I've shown you how the superficial temporal artery is blocked. I've shown you how the vertex follicle pad / organ dies.
No, you haven't demonstrated any of that. The superficial temporal artery is not related to baldness at all, otherwise the surgical procedure to ligate it would cause hair loss, but it doesn't. I know I'm getting repetitive at this point, but it is only because you keep bringing up this myth that the obstruction of the superficial temporal artery causes hair loss, and you imply jaw position has something to do with that, but you haven't even provided any good evidence that is true. In fact, looking at CAT scans, it looks like it isn't true since the superficial temporal artery runs above the TMJ. The Doppler data you provided to back up your point is completely inadequate. And furthermore, it doesn't matter anyways because blood flow doesn't have anything to do with hair loss to begin with. And why would it? Low blood flow is just a consequence, not a cause of hair loss, because when hair follicles die, they are replaced by scar tissue, and scar tissue is largely avascular. So low blood flow occurs after the baldness has already happened, not beforehand. So, not that I can stomach much more of this, but fortunately, there is not much more left, so let's go ahead and hear his conclusion.
Now, I know my science is new, and it's going to take some time to learn. And it also comes in 50 years after the genetic discovery, which has gone nowhere, like the other Band-Aid fixes of balding in the past.
No, Dr. Dye, your theory is not new. Your theory is the old obsolete theory that has been reheated in a microwave to make it palatable to a new generation of idiots you are hoping to scam. The idea that hair loss is caused by scalp tension and low blood flow is an idea that dates back all the way to the Victorian era. The proven role of DHT's role in causing hair loss is the modern theory, and it is the one that is accepted by all serious hair loss researchers, which you of course are not one of, and that is why nobody else has ever come to your conclusions because they think it was a joke, which it is. He then says the genetic theory went nowhere, but he's wrong on that. It's the blood flow theory that went nowhere, which is why the only people these days who actually promote it are snake oil salesmen like Hairguard, Rob England, Paul Taylor, and now yourself, Dr. Dye. Actual research into the genetics of hair loss have given us a highly effective treatment in the form of finasteride. Finasteride is not a band-aid. It is the most effective hair loss treatment that has ever been developed, and it will stop hair loss in the vast majority of people who use it. You downplay this drug as being just a band-aid, but literally just 50 years ago, people had no options whatsoever for fighting androgenic alopecia, and the fact that millions of men suffering from androgenic alopecia now have easy access to an effective treatment is not something that should be dismissed dismissed as just a band-aid treatment. There's a lot of serious ongoing research on new hair loss treatments that are genuinely promising, like GT20029, piralutamide, and the Wnt pathway drugs that I've made videos on all of them, but you'll notice these treatments all have something in common. They all either treat hair loss directly by targeting DHT or by targeting a downstream effect of DHT. Nobody is researching ways to treat hair loss by improving blood flow, because the only people who believe improving blood flow treats hair loss are conspiracy theorist flat earther types who deny the moon landing and are complete idiots. You're like the stereotypical mad scientist who is crazy but insists he's not the crazy one, he's just the only sane one who remains. I am sorry, Dr. Dye, your theories have long since been abandoned and the hair loss industry is better off because of it. Your theory isn't going to save orthodontics, and it is never going to gain any kind of traction anywhere outside of a few posts on Reddit that most people will laugh at.
Rest assured, this is not a band-aid fix. This is the cure. And I know there's been money and education pumped into this for the last 50 years. It's going to take a long time to eliminate that, but the truth prevails. And all I can hope is that anyone concerned with balding gets the opportunity to view this evidence-based science, and then they can make their own decisions a little easier.
So this guy thinks he's the modern day Galileo. That kind of reminds me of another video I did. I will say though that unlike a lot of other sociopathic con men in the hair loss industry who know they are fooling their victims, I think Brian Dye is actually convinced of his bullshit, which is pretty sad if you think about it. He's clearly got hope and passion, but it takes more than hopes, dreams, and wishes to cure hair loss, and no matter how much he wants his theory to be true, it's not going to happen because it is based on a foundation of disproven theories. An actual cure for hair loss will happen eventually, in my belief, but the cure will be based on genetic research, and I actually have a video on that which I'll link below. But when Dr. Dye says that an archaic, obsolete, disproven theory like the blood flow theory is the key to solving hair loss, it is basically just the equivalent of saying the solution to climate change is going back to coal power plants. The scientific community has moved on from such nonsense, and so should Dr. Dye. If not, then he should stick to his practice of tightening braces while he still has a chance, since the industry only has a few more years in it at best. So, I'll see you all next time, my fellow hair loss witchers, and I will be back with that dutasteride video soon. So until then, God bless.